Hi, this is James Vaccaro. I'm the Executive Director of the Climate Safe Lending Network. It's a pleasure to join today live from COP27 here at the Bankers for Net Zero stand in the Green Zone. Today, Climate Safe Lending Network, which is a multi-stakeholder network of banks and their stakeholders, the whole panoply of investors, regulators, academics, NGOs and activists come together to discuss what is it that can move banks forward in terms of decarbonising and setting a course towards net zero in the best way. And having been a strategy director of a bank in my past, really interested in this new theme of putting together a transition plan. We know that transition plans are going to be necessary. They're in some countries, including the UK, going to be mandatory soon. But what is it that's going to define them being good enough? How are climate strategies going to interact with all of the rest of the things within a corporate strategy, thinking about nature, thinking about social justice, thinking about the economics and commercial realities of managing a financial institution? Those are the strategy questions which we're trying to help those who are holding the pen on setting about these new transition plans, these effective strategies of transition as they go forward. We have got a new set of tools on our website. It builds upon some of the recent announcements from the Glasgow Finance Alliance on net zero and the UK's Transition Plan Task Force. Our tools are disarmingly pragmatic. So they are some strategy tools. There's some PowerPoint slides that bankers could use to actually bring together some of the conversations amongst their management teams or stakeholders to figure out what it is they're going to do to make the decisions that they need to make. We've got some other things which I'll maybe refer to later on, but I'm delighted to be joined here today by two people who are really involved in this from the perspective of setting the frameworks up for transition plans and holding the pen on those strategy conversations. So here with me on the couch we have Riona Bauhe from the Transition Plan Task Force in the UK, set up by the UK government to advise on what should be in a transition plan, not just for banks, but for all financial institutions and listed companies. And Wendy Dobson, who's the co-chair of the UN Principles for Responsible Banking and leads sustainability at Standard Bank. Welcome, both of you. You're both involved in transition plans and climate strategies, like in depth. And you are sort of in different ways kind of holding all of the different stakeholders and people involved. Let's start there with who needs to be involved in setting a strategy. It's not just that you say when you just lock yourself in a room, or maybe you did lock yourself in a room and then produce something, but how do you involve your stakeholders in creating a good transition plan?
Thank you, James. And congratulations on launching this pragmatic toolkit. We need more pragmatism and more tools and things about how we actually get this done to make good on our pledges and commitments. So who was involved? So Standard Bank released its first group climate policy earlier this year, which sets out our transition targets towards net zero by 2050. And it was like herding cats to get that to that point where we could release it publicly. And that involved discussions with business. So the deal teams, the sector heads, the people who own the client relationships, they had to be critical and centrally involved in this process. So without them involved, we might have had a great sounding plan that ticked a lot of boxes, but it wouldn't be implemented. And the key thing is that when you make a pledge by 2050, this group of people, we're not going to be at the AGM in 2050 to account for this. So getting the business guys involved is important. Then the risk teams have to be involved as well, and they were important parts of the process. Then our CEO, and certain members of our board were centrally involved. So internally keeping those groups involved. Externally, it was about investors, and not just the friendly ones, but the shareholder activists, and talking to them as well. That was also useful, but also talking to peer banks. So that was where the Principles for Responsible Banking sort of family became very useful, was actually talking to other banks who were a little bit further ahead and learning from them on the journey. So those were the critical stakeholders that we involved in our strategy process.
Great, thanks. And great to be here, James. Thank you very much for the invitation. So as many of you may know, that this week the UK Transition Plan Task Force released its disclosure framework and interpretive guidance for preparing a transition plan. And within that guidance, we have a whole chapter on how you go about preparing a transition plan, which results then in a disclosure. And in that, we talk about who should be involved. And in any organization, not just in banks, it's a cross-functional approach. It's obviously your finance teams, it's your risk teams, it's your strategies, your sector leads, it's the sustainability teams, and making sure that you're coming together and really teasing out the issues and iterating it throughout. It's not a one-stop shop. You have to go through trying, testing, piloting different schemes within the organization, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and engaging with those external stakeholders, as you said, so the shareholders, with your industry peers, sharing practices. No one can do this in a vacuum, so you have to keep working together and sharing your experiences to meet that common goal.
Thank you. And as you said, Wendy, I mean, it is about speaking to the stakeholders, whether they're friendly or not. And one of the things in the Good Transition Plan Strategy Toolkit, which we've launched today, is the updated version of a little game called the Pledge. So we recognize that actually banks speaking to activists, it's really not that easy. Come and have a conversation. So we've actually got a game simulation that a game designer helps us create, which is quite fun. There's a competitive element for banks competing with one another, but also a collaborative element in terms of, well, what's happening to the climate. So thinking how do we sort of break the ice and really kind of break new ground on that. Thank you. Riona, you mentioned about this iterative process. And obviously, if you were to write a transition plan today, and you were to look back at it in 10 years from now, you'd probably go, oh my goodness, what were we thinking? Because there's so much which we don't know is going to happen. And there's so many breakthroughs. I mean, here at COP, I mean, there are so many innovations and new ideas. How do you plan for rapid transitions and breakthroughs? What is it that you need to be designing into your process for non-linearity in the market?
No, you're spot on there. And if you think about, many organizations will be preparing a transition plan, again, like using a specific pathway. And the one thing that we know is that pathway will not necessarily happen. That's like almost like the one thing that's known. There will be so many things that move and change over that time. So you need to be dynamic, you need to be adaptable, you need to obviously do things like forming a sensitivity analysis, which we recommend in the framework, to actually stress test your plan. You also need to be thinking about the exposure to physical risks. So how can you ensure you can deliver your plan in a changing climate? It's obviously right now, we don't need to know, no one needs to be converted on that point. And making sure that you have really good governance and checks and balances in place. So you're speaking to the right people, and that you're thinking about things like policy interventions that need to be made. You've got the right people who is being trained to detect potential risks, and also things like management information. How are you getting that constant data that you can understand and flex your organization's approach at short notice?
To build on that, scenario analysis is critical. So what we're doing is we're actually building capability around scenario analysis. So what we did is we published our first set of targets in March in a number of sectors: oil and gas, thermal coal, renewable energy, and we started work on agriculture because it's a big part of our business. What we've done more recently is run some stress testing using different scenarios from the Network for Greening the financial system. And so there's different scenarios in there about if there's a disorderly transition, the hothouse transition, and looked at what's going to happen. Are these targets adequate? Is this plan that we've got enough or not? And what do we do with that information? But that's not a one-off. So what we've decided to do is build the capability to do this on an ongoing basis. Absolutely agree. You need to put governance in place so that those results get fed into the decision-making process. And we're also partnering with academic institutions. So I think this is useful. So, you know, as a bank, especially a bank in a developing country, you can't always have these things in-house. So you've got to work with universities, with scientists, so that you can get access to data, access to models, and just be flexible and understand that one and done is not going to happen. It's actually now going to have to be business as usual, to be constantly reviewing and refining your plan as you go along.
No, that's great. And obviously the climate strategy can't live outside the context of your overall corporate strategy. And we've been dealing with, I mean, the pandemic and war in Ukraine. There's the disruption already in the banking sector in terms of technology and other advances there. So, and we're hardly likely to expect that volatility to slow down because what we know is that climate is going to exacerbate all those forces. I wonder, in terms of, a transition plan, it is the preparation, and the whole sort of theme for all the events and Bankers for Net Zero and Climate Safe Learning Network, all these organizations are always thinking about, well, how do we actually get into action? So what is the practical implementation look like? I know that you mentioned something on home loans sector. That's where it really kind of the rubber hits the road, when it's just a relationship manager speaking to a client. What is it they can do to help them go faster, to have more security and confidence in that transition?
Well, a critical thing to make sure your plan gets implemented is you have to do learning and development in your organization. This climate change is this very complicated topic that touches everything. Every part of your business, every part of society is affected. But it's also an area that's full of jargon and full of technical terms. And, so if you become a specialist in this area, you struggle to keep up, even though you're a specialist. Now you take your relationship managers and your deal teams and other people in a bank, and they don't know what just transition is. They don't know what 1.5. They don't know, even having to explain to me what's COP, things like that. So what we've done is we are putting in place a extensive learning and development program targeted at different audiences within our organization. So board executives, people who are responsible for client engagement, then just general, so that everybody in the bank at least has some sense of what these things all mean. So investing in that, investing in your people so they can have those client conversations, we've realized is a key component to making this happen.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. It really is about changing your organizational culture when it comes to climate. In the Transition Plan Task Force framework that was released this week, there's a whole sub-element that we talk specifically about, how do you actually embed climate within your culture? And obviously the mechanisms with which you do that, it is about the education piece. It's about updating your policies and processes, your systems. Having a full end-to-end change management program is integral. So as you're devising your strategy, you're thinking about the policies and processes you need, and policies and conditions in terms of asset origination and engagement to go with it, obviously, and thinking about the products and services, and then obviously the people to be able to resource that, and obviously the finance as well. And when we come to people and finance, obviously executive remuneration is something that kind of people think, making sure you have the right mechanisms in place to engage the right people for delivery of the plan, because often does come down to that, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's super. And it's great that you both bring up that theme of learning and development, something that certainly in the climate safe lending network, we feel in the ecosystem there's a lot of acronyms and frameworks and the headwork to get around it, and it's really hard. I mean, it's intellectually challenging, and yet the job of change is much more about what's happening in the organization. What are the organizational dynamics, the culture, the mindset? What is it? How do you become an entrepreneur? How do you become an effective change maker? And our fellowship program, which is a peer network of bankers, is really supporting how to make change at that level. And those translations, as you sort of said, Wendy, it's about, well, what do people understand? Most people don't actually know what COP is. And in fact, even quite a few people here might not know what COP really is. But in terms of the context, in terms of the alignment, you've got these forces from different sides. So this week there was announcements from GFANZ. We had the things from Race to Zero. We had the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group putting very stringent kind of benchmarks in terms of what would be required. But there's also the reality that in some countries, well, there's not a context for net zero in terms of the public policy context. So how do we make sense of our own decisions in the light of, on one hand, people saying you've got to go an awful lot faster and now, and on others sort of say, well, actually, how can you, because that's not the context that you operate within. Who wants to take that first? It's a really difficult.
Well, as a bank that operates in 20 African countries, this is our dilemma, if you like. We've made commitments to net zero by 2050, but we can't go as fast as, especially in, say, the first 10 years, as the Net Zero Banking Alliance has set out. We operate in countries that have virtually zero emissions. I mean, if we take South Africa out of the equation, because South Africa is a big emitter, if we take Africa, it's less than 4% of global emissions. You've got 600 million people in Africa who have no access to electricity. And those people have a right to a dignified life. They have legitimate needs and aspirations. And we can't go, Africa is the dark continent. If you see satellite images at night of Africa, it's dark. Now, we can't keep Africa in the dark. A transition can't mean from the dark to the dark for Africa. And it's unrealistic to think that you can transition completely to renewables overnight. You can't industrialize completely using renewables. There has to be gas in the mix, for example, and that's controversial. We understand that. So how do we find what is a good enough transition plan for a company in Africa? And also, that might be very different for a company in Nigeria to a company in Malawi, to a company in Angola, to a company in Niger. And we have to have more context-specific approaches that recognize, you can't have a mitigation plan if you're not emitting emissions. We've also got to look at things like the role of carbon offsets with integrity. But if you look at the role of the equatorial forests in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they absorb 4% of global emissions. So actually, Africa is already net zero. And these are some of the things that we've at the moment, I feel that we're deepening the divide between the global north and the global south in a lot of the frameworks, the pledges, the tools that are coming out, because there's no second track. So we know what best practice is looking like in terms of transitioning, in terms of decarbonization. But as African companies, we finding ourselves falling further behind. And that shouldn't be the case. So it's not that we don't want to be part of this. We absolutely do. But how do we develop frameworks, access to data, models that are relevant for Africa that help us be part of this process?
Just one quick follow-up question on it, because we just had the US midterms, and if there's a better reminder of the polarity in politics, I'm sure I know one, but this isn't just the US. This is in lots of countries, and things can really swing from one side to the other. very quickly. Now, as a bank, you're making fairly long-term decisions, and you're needing to think through, well, how might we future-proof our own decisions against what might be potentially, very progressive policies, or it could work the other way around. But how might you best set a course, a strategy, which might be sort of climate policy, progressive policy ready in this kind of context, if it's not necessarily all aligned in maybe in countries like South Africa now?
Well, one of the advantages that we have as Standard Bank is that we're 160 years old. Last month was our birthday, and when you've been around that long in a country like South Africa, you do tend to take a longer view of things, and you've seen massive transitions in politics. You've gone from an apartheid regime to democracy, and that transition was negotiated over 4 years. So this is not our first transition in that respect, and that sense of we have to make sense of what is right for us and our stakeholders, not just our shareholders, but we also know our shareholders are pensioners. They are people saving for the future. We have to think about our employees. We employ 55,000 people. We have to think about the millions of ordinary people we bank and provide home loans to and insurance to. So we have to make decisions where politics is one factor, but it's not the only factor. And sometimes I think it can be easy to hide behind politics as an excuse rather than to set your own course that's congruent with your values as an organization.
Completely agree. Yeah, really spot on. And I think to be able to do that, you need to build the right architecture in place within your political systems to ensure that when there is a new government that comes into power, they aren't able to roll back. You have the right systems in place to be able to continue to deliver the nations and private sector and public sector's climate progress forward throughout that time. I think also just wanted to kind of touch on your sort of initial point, which was around sort of, I guess, sort of I'm sort of, if I'm right, sort of understanding sort of the implementation piece and talking around the challenges around sort of targets and how do you embed that in the business. There's a bit of a dichotomy between sort of ambition and action at the moment that we're seeing, and that's particularly around sort of financing of oil and gas at the moment. Very hot topic with the UNH that came out this week, and obviously that's specifically called out the role of the banking sector within that, and what they should and shouldn't be fine in terms of not just coal, but also oil and gas as well. And it's going to be really interesting to see how organisations respond to that in this climate changing landscape, and really making sure that, different parts of the ecosystem and the architecture all move together and talk on the same message. There needs to be a collaboration. I feel sometimes these organizations work in silos, and then people don't know sort of organizations which one to be listening to. So it's really challenging sort of, and what we've tried to do in the Transition Plan Task Force is try and, we're very closely aligned with GFANZ. We build off the global baseline of the ISSB and TCFD from a reporting perspective, and really showing, that we all works together and trying to sort of create convergence, not divergence, on transition plan disclosures.
Thank you. And I mean, the UK Transition Plan Task Force, I mean, it's a world first. I mean, sort of UK is going first in terms of this, and the fact that it's mandatory means that, well, it's not just, well, those who want to do this. It's actually making sure that it's leveling up the playing field for all. And I assume that, I mean, when we talk about government and government policy, of course, banks they're not entirely neutral partners in terms of their influence. I mean, banks have got quite a lot of often outsized influence, and there's been initiatives. I think Race to Zero launched one today, but before that, there's the Global Standard on Climate Aligned Lobbying. Banks have got a seat at the table in being able to both level up what the whole financial sector does, but also to be able to sort of say, hey, look, if we were to get certain policies, specific policies, then we could do these specific actions. And Bankers for Net Zero has been doing that in the UK, trying to identify that sort of contingent optimism. It's the sort of well, we could build it if we had this specific tool at this particular time. love your thoughts on the role of, on that sort of like the leveling up in terms of carrying the whole sector forward, and more broadly perhaps on, well, what should banks be doing in terms of their engagement on public policy, and not, as you say, hiding behind the government, but actually really helping to drive that forward?
I think in terms of policy, I mean, it's, we all need to move together on this. So, that's why, organisation, alliance like Bankers for Net Zero and also NZBA, working together as an industry to ensure that you are pushing, policymakers to actually ensure they have the right framework in place to enable you to transition. And that's really key to be able to do that. And, the UK Transition Plan Task Force was brought to as industry-led initiative, obviously sponsored by the Treasury in the UK, but our steering group are private sector organisations. We have the Bank of England is an observer on the steering group, and also we have NatWest on it. So bankers are trying to, along with the financial services and real economy, are really trying to push forward. In terms of what you disclose on your climate lobbying and activities, it's really about transparency. What associations are you a part of? What are you doing in those associations? What is your role? How are those associations trying to lobby for climate positive, and ensure that that they're, and also being very transparent that you're not involved in any sort of anti-climate lobbying as well? And how do those your role with them actually help meet your net zero commitments?
100% support those points. I think it's about acting with integrity. So it is making sure that you have a consistent and aligned approach in what you say in public and what you say in private to policymakers, regulators, legislators. Not hiding behind trade associations is also really, really critical. So you put all the nice things in your reports and on your website, but you're a member of trade associations or funding think tanks that are actually doing it, sort of more negative sort of lobbying. But I think also you need to engage with a problem-solving mindset and look at how do you co-create solutions with policymakers, with regulators. We're doing a lot of work with our central bank. Our central bank has set up a climate change think tank to start the process of putting in place prudential regulations for banks around climate risk and climate change. And it's working in a problem-solving way with them, with integrity, and sharing with them, look, this, and actually we find ourselves that we're pushing them. We want them to move faster, because if you have the right regulatory framework and the right policy framework, you can move a lot faster because you've got consistency, you've got more certainty, and it helps you. So, the right kind of proportional, well thought through regulations and policies actually of benefit to companies on their transition.
No, that's great, and our experience. So again, Climate Safe Lending Network convenes across all of these different stakeholders, and we deal with regulators and bankers on these issues. And one of the things which we find is that the regulators, especially when you're looking at the upper echelons in the Basel Committee, they speak to financial institutions a lot, but they speak to the lobbyists and the people who have public policy rather than the relationship managers who can just explain how it works on the ground. And that's some of that sort of, those insights are really gold dust in being able to go, oh, right, so this is what might actually happen. And I think there's a real yearning to kind of get some more of those insights in. We've got a live studio audience today, and I'm just going to warm up that there's going to be a possibility for questions in a moment. But I'm going to ask one more question to sort of just so you can hone your interventions, and it's really about communication. And how do we bring all of this to life in a way that is meaningful to everyone? I mean, there's a lot of different users, and the Transition Plan Task Force has done an amazing job at really thinking through the user journeys. But we do have a lot of 100-page documents now, and every word is being weighed and the data is being poured over. If transition plans just become another one of those on top of what we've got, isn't it just going to overwhelm people? And so what do we do to help people to drill down into the things which are most most relevant to them?
Honestly, spot on. I'm so fed up of reading 100-page reports. But at the same time, you know, it's like tangent, but it is really useful to have a standalone document. And that's why the Transition Plan Task Force has recommended that you should produce a standalone plan, because a lot of people only want to look at one document, and it's good to have it all in one place, because you then also allows you to tell your story. How does it fit in with your wider business strategy? If it becomes a tick-boxing template exercise, it just seems a sort of like a regulatory sort of piece, whereas actually it is a whole strategic piece to completely, essentially transform your business, how you view, you know, basically every single decision making to ensure it aligns with your net zero commitment. So I think, and that's really important for different users. So yes, I'll stop there. I can go on for a long time.
This is where we need the next toolkit, James. Communication, because it really is challenging. There's different audiences, and you need to package information because they have different information needs. Investors are looking for something that may be different to your own employees, that's different to what civil society wants. And then you have a whole lot of sort of reporting obligations through things like TCFD or Net Zero Banking Alliance. And you end up producing more than thousands of pages of disclosures and reports. I agree, it comes down to you've got to tell a compelling story, and that story has to be backed up by evidence and case studies, and to some extent that has to be verified by your assurance providers in some cases. But I'm not sure we're getting the communication right. Because we've seen what has happened to some organizations, some companies whose advertising has been received sanctions because they've been accused of greenwashing. It's very hard to put a nuanced view on a billboard. And this is really, really, I think, something we've got to spend a bit more time thinking through and understanding how to do this.
And there's maybe the ramification is that there's going to be people saying, well, I won't say anything. So there's green hushing is the new phrase in town, where it's sort of, well, is the scrutiny, which is absolutely necessary on greenwashing, going to have the inadvertent impact of just making people say less? I'm going to see if there's any questions in the audience. We'll take a couple of questions. Maybe you can get
it is Gender Day on Monday here at COP27, and I wondered whether, speaking of green hushing, we know that women are significantly impacted by climate change, and I wonder if in the work that you guys are doing, if there's anything gender related that you can share with us in terms of progress.
Thank you, dear.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, we are here at COP to fight climate change, not to talk about climate change, although you get the impression that we like talking a lot, like until 3 a.m. and then get up at 7 a.m. and again talk. But we really need to implement transition plans, right? And also having a transition plan in itself is also talk. Now, the ECB last week published a shocking report that the ECB supervisors actually do talk to bankers themselves. The joint supervisory teams do go into the banks. And when I talk to bankers, it's nasty. They don't like it because they are taken away from their business and they have to explain to the supervisors, what are you doing? And the ECB finds that of all the systemic banks across Europe, 95% only talks about climate change. Yeah, it's bad, and we should do something. Now, question to you, how do you get transition plans actually implemented? And maybe digging into that, do we need regulation that will charge a deviation from the targets in the transition plans? Like Pillar 1 capital charges, now we go into technical details. Pillar 1 capital charges that on excessive finance of the wrong stuff compared to the transition plan. Would it help implementation?
Ian Buller from UK Finance. I wanted to ask about nature, actually, given the links that are being made at this COP between, well, toward the next COP15, the biodiversity COP in Montreal. How are your institutions thinking about drawing in nature to transition planning, if at all? And what are some of the challenges that you're facing and solutions to those challenges? Thanks.
Super questions. Thank you. So let's start maybe with a little bit the first and the last. I mean, when we're talking about climate strategies can't exist independent of context, and all of the SDGs, gender, financial inclusion, nature, all of it has to be part of that broad strategy. And looking at all of the tensions and opportunities, that's one of the key things. That's what strategy is, really. How do you make decisions in that kind of context? So maybe for gender and nature and maybe other SDGs which are important, which climate will inevitably touch. What are the ways in which you might frame some of those issues, and how might you want to see that reflected in a transition plan?
So these are really great questions, and certainly been hot topics throughout the course of this week. And interestingly, women are most disproportionately affected by climate change. They pick up the slack when it comes to this. So it's a very spot on point to raise. In terms of the UK Transition Plan Task Force work, we obviously gender hasn't necessarily overtly been called out, but we have material interdependencies in terms of how your transition plan is impacted by sort of communities, wider stakeholders, and nature as well. And thinking about, as you are preparing a transition plan, how does it think about those sort of broader issues and make sure it considers them, particularly recognizing different sectors and sort of, regions that organizations operate in. And I think I think the challenge always with nature is that there to date hasn't been sort of a really robust framework around nature. It's harder to quantify than carbon emissions, sort of the different impacts that it has. So, it's really great to see the work of the TNFD, so the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and they brought out their latest updated guidance this week. So we need to continue to move on all fronts. We need all these different reporting frameworks to operate together, and we need, hopefully, in future transition plans start to bring in those broader issues, and it's not just decarbonisation, it is nature and other related issues as well.
The integrated, interconnected nature of all of these issues is something that in the Principles for Responsible Banking has accelerated up the agenda in the last 6 months. So we're really focusing now on the concept of just transition. There's actually a fantastic paper that's just been released by the Grantham Institute on just transition, which is really helpful. But these issues are intersectional. Whether it's gender, human rights, biodiversity, employment, you have to pull them all together. Otherwise, you can't get implementation because you leave people behind. So we're looking at things very much around jobs and enterprises, financial inclusion as part of transition. What do you do? How do you create green jobs? How do you responsibly decommission coal-fired power stations and retrain, resettle people that are affected around that? You have to do that. We've also done work with UN Women on climate smart agriculture projects in a number of Southern African countries. So look at how you give women sustainable livelihoods, and that uses climate smart nature-based solutions. It enhances food security. So I think what we have to do with these things is we have to be integrative rather than additive. We've got to find ways to do it together, because we're just getting to grips with this. We were about to do, in March, we'll publish our 4th TCFD report. It's still not a great report, but each time it gets better. But if I go into my bank and say, okay, now we have to do a TNFD report, I may not make it back out to the next COP. So it's about how do we bring these things together in an integrated way, I think is the key to action.
So just, I mean, connecting that, I mean, integrative approaches, there's maybe ways of being able to redesign some of these dilemmas so they become win-wins. And we've heard about win-wins. There's people on this couch earlier this week talking about the win-wins, and just earlier in the Africa discussion, talking about how adaptation and resilience could be met through nature, which is also in itself a mitigation strategy. But the downside of win-wins, or rather the incompleteness of win-wins, comes to the other question there about, and there are some things which are just not win-wins and may need to be curbed by regulation, which, you know, no bank is going to necessarily sort of say, yes, we demand more regulation, because that would be a pretty, you know, violent behavioral change. But how do we deal with the fact that there are going to be some things which go beyond the win-wins, which are going to require regulation? You mentioned, Wendy, in South Africa, the central bank looking at prudential rules. I know that in Canada at the Senate, we had Senator Rosa Galvez join one of our meetings. There's a Climate Aligned Finance Act. We've had there's the European legislation at the moment, the review of the capital rules requirements. What is going to be necessary, do you think, you know, whether it's liked or appreciated right now or not, in the form of regulation?
Well, I do think that regulation, and particularly anything to do with capital requirements, gets bankers' attention. So the more that sort of stick is dangled, that will focus minds of banks. South Africa is interesting because it's also got a carbon tax. And our national treasury sees the carbon tax as the key driver of South Africa's transition. And it introduced it at a fairly low level, but it's ratcheting it up. And the idea is that you need to have, you can use offsets, but again, there has to be integrity, there has to be credibility, they have to be certified, for example. And you have to start decarbonizing, otherwise you're going to pay a massive tax, which the government is hoping will drive a lot of social changes in consumption habits. And so that's another sort of regulatory tool that can be used. We also have a climate change bill going through our parliament, which will require all of government at different levels, as well as other types of organizations, to have transition plans in place. And I do think we mentioned it early, but remuneration is also important, and looking at whether you have disclosure around remuneration and whether you have non-financial performance as part of what's in a remuneration package for executives. We took a decision in Standard Bank that we had to sacrifice the pace of our program for buy-in in the bank. We realized that if we didn't get what I call the hardcore bankers involved in this process and get their buy-in to this process, it wouldn't be implemented. And they are accountable for the climate targets. In fact, we got them to present it to our board. It wasn't sustainability that did it. The Corporate Investment Bank presented it to the board, and they have to own it. But we did have to then compromise on how quickly we're moving. So not the ambition at the end, but the sort of more short term and the pace of it. And it's the thin end of the wedge. They've bought into it now. They're not going to be able to backtrack on it because it's public. The board's approved it. So we'll also start ratcheting up the level of ambition.
Great. So you've got an implementation strategy, an engagement strategy, and a strategy for the hardcore bankers. That's super. Just wondering if there was one last question. I wasn't sure if there was one from Sarah at the back. I'll bring you the microphone.
Yeah, it's kind of been addressed, because I was going to talk about there being, you know, the carbon transition, the nature transition, which Ian raised, and the just transition and how we kind of make plans that factor those all in together and bring them together. So I think you've pretty covered that, but it is certainly difficult, and I think it does tie into this issue of reporting that's been talked about and how fragmented that can be. Thank you.
Yeah, if there's time for one more question. Again, about regulation. The Good Transition Plan actually has a lot of details. I mean, it's a great list of content, and you don't have to think and you can fill it in. Wonderful. Now, regulators are, of course, also now drafting legislation as to what should be in a transition plan. I usually find that the more details in the regulation, the less effective, because the admin burden rises and it's not really fit for, one certain corporate. But then, of course, there are a few painful bits in a transition plan which should always be there, and which may be, not necessarily supported by everyone because they're painful. What are those bits that should always be in a transition plan, and for which you would hope that they end up in regulation, because then you avoid that fight with your stakeholders?
Super question. I think it might turn that one straight to Riona in terms of what are the bits that people might want to talk about, and you're going to get them to talk about them.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'll just quickly touch on regulation, then I'll talk about what should be included in transition plans. So at present, transition plans in the UK are not mandatory. So companies from next year will have to prepare a transition plan on a comply or explain basis in line with the TCFD disclosure requirements. It's snappy, right? But in the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority have indicated that when they update their climate listing rules in due course, they may incorporate the TPT's outputs in those updated rules. Now, what's interesting is, we're, as part of the TPT, we're running a sandboxing phase to get organisations trying to start using the Transition Plan Task Force framework in earnest and really kick the tyres and work out what does and doesn't work before we finalise it next year. And we're hoping that with the guidance of GFANZ, the guidance of the TPT, before it becomes mandatory, we have organisations producing transition plans to the level of granularity and specificity that we outline in the framework. And we're not mandating that organisations have to set a net zero target. We're not mandating that they have to, have their board sign it off. We're not necessarily. There's no requirements to disclose specific metrics per se, but what we are asking them is to be transparent whether they have set a target, whether it is science-based, and what that target is, whether they're using carbon credits in the assumptions that they're using, when are those credits going to be bought and retired. So by presenting that information, then organizations think, oh, maybe I should consider what I'm putting out into the market. And it's interesting, I didn't realize that about South Africa. You're currently thinking about preparing transition plans. This week, the German bank, the Bundesbank, indicated that they would like transition plans. So it's really starting to become the norm, and really, organizations will start producing very high quality transition plans. And finally, I'll just say, so for the UK Transition Plan Task Force, we have a sort of 3 guiding principles. So it's ambition, action, and accountability. And we are asking for a strategic and rounded approach. So when you design your transition plan, it is really focusing on not just your entity level decarbonisation, but thinking about the spheres of influence you have available to help enable economy-wide decarbonisation and avoid those unintended consequences of paper decarbonisation. And in doing that, we framed our framework. We've got 5 elements: foundations, implementation strategy, engagement strategy, metrics and targets and governance. And within those, there's 19 sub-elements. So really, really granular detail, but it really should provide great transparency as to where the organisation sits.
I was just going to do probably just before the final wrap up, just checking that in terms of integrating nature, integrating just transition, in terms of activating the transition. I mean, in terms of what banks can do, well, some of the things which they can do is to start changing their offers and start changing the conditions. There's a shout out to a wonderful UK project called the Chancery Lane Project, which is just some lawyers who say, well, here's some clauses which might work in your financial agreements and facility agreements. I wonder, in terms of how you might, I mean, you're working a lot in South Africa and across Africa in just transition, how you might be embedding some of that in some of the really down to earth tools that relationship managers are using on a day-to-day basis.
So in a bank, your credit processes are critical. So it's really important that your climate strategy or transition plan gets reflected in how you make credit decisions. And that's something that we are focusing on. And especially setting new kinds of exclusions. So automatically just certain things will not be financed anymore. And that's important because we've had a subsidiary in a not in South Africa approach us to say, oh, we're thinking about financing a coal-fired power station. And after getting up off the chair, we were able to say, well, we direct you to, clause 5 of our group board-approved climate policy, which says we no longer fund coal-fired power stations. But there are other kinds as well. There are exclusions and restrictions in agriculture, in natural gas, and so on. Then we're also looking at putting in more rigorous requirements around social risk and human rights. So even, we all focus on renewable energy, but renewable energy has got some negative consequences. You might have to resettle people. There's also the mining of the minerals you need, for batteries and so on. And that's been associated with a lot of child labor in certain African countries. So that's why you need this holistic approach. But what we've realized is we've got to bed that into your screening of transactions, and also, very importantly, your monitoring of whether your clients are living up to those conditions on which you've granted them credit. And then what we're doing is we're also offering performance-based lending facilities. So if you transition, if you meet certain targets, you will pay less interest. And so that's making it a lot more sort of practical on the ground in terms of implementation.
Super. So rounding off, and I'm going to sort of, it's a difficult one to kind of end the session with, but I wonder, as people who are thinking about setting the frameworks for transition plans, people who are writing transition plans, what advice you might have, or if there's specific ideas which you may be pinched from elsewhere, whether it's peers or other industries, to help banks and their clients to go further, to go faster, to go fairer. And something that I've been having conversations with bankers who are looking at some of the critiques about products where there have been kind of claims of greenwashing. You just say, well, do the critique of all the things which have been said which are wrong, and how would you flip each of those? How would you flip each of those? And it's, well, it's quite difficult to do that, but as a mental exercise, it can be really quite a good way of being able to nurture some creativity. Any tips, ideas, thoughts on something, especially maybe for one of your peers who's just about to start going down the journey you've been down, perhaps, Wendy, in creating a transition plan? What might you point them in the direction of?
A couple of things. You need to get somebody very senior in the organization as a champion. We had our board chairman who was really committed and really asked our senior management teams really tough questions. So that helped. And what also helped is we, as sort of the biggest bank in Africa, got targeted by civil society and shareholder activists. And we've had some horrible AGMs. And at the same time as they're at the AGM, we've had Extinction Rebellion outside the building as well. And that's not nice to deal with, but it really helped push our progress. So sometimes if you're and you feel a little bit like the jam in the sandwich, if you're the one leading this in your organization, but sometimes you can use that external pressure to accelerate your internal process.
So it's interesting. So, well, first of all, I would I would direct them to the Transition Plan Task Force framework and guidance, hot off the press, because we do have in that. So we set out the key stages you should be taking when you are preparing and designing your transition plan. And it's interesting actually, when I speak to organisations in the UK and you discuss the framework with them, they actually say we're doing a lot of this stuff already, bringing it all together. And like you say, once you've got the in from the senior stakeholder, you then at an operational level need to create a cross-functional working group, as we touched on in the first question, to make sure they're all talking to each other. So it's actually an exercise to bring everyone together and integrate those different perspectives from across the organisation, and then assess, well, if what are we doing? Will this actually sort of do a bit of a gap analysis? Will this actually help us meet where we need to get for our interim targets? It's not your 2050 targets, it's your short to medium term targets. And I think going through that process will really, it's a bit of a journey, and certainly give yourself enough time to do it, because it will not happen overnight. It is, it will take a lot of time and speaking to the right stakeholders, but hopefully that helps.
Thank you. It is an iterative journey. The Good Transition Plan, which we've launched today, is itself on its iterative journey. It will be fed and continually fed by new insights from people like you, Riona and Wendy, and others across the globe. It's a free resource, and we encourage you to download it from climatesafelending.org and to give feedback on it. I just want to express huge appreciation to Riona and Wendy for joining me today. Thank you to Bankers for Net Zero. It's been great. It's been a really great week. There's been a lot of excitement and new announcements, but actually a lot of great conversation in this room. So thank you very much for joining, and that's it. Thank you.